believe in the ripple effect.
What's up? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Ricardo Rendes, also known as Ricky Brands, and a great episode for you today. Today we have best-selling author, thinker, philosopher, researcher, and someone who isn't afraid to go against the grain, Jeffrey Masson, and he is the author of The Assault on Truth, Freud's Suppression of the Seduction Theory. In this book, and Jeffrey have a very interesting story. We'll go in details during the podcast, but just a brief overview. Jeffrey became intrigued with Freud's work, got close to Freud's daughter, Anna, and he was also a director and worked at the Freud archives. During this podcast, we'll talk about how Jeffrey uncovered a suppressed theory of Freud, and we also get into why this research was suppressed and why Jeffrey got so much backlash when trying to expose the suppressed research. I'm sure you're going to love this podcast. As always, I try to bring you the most interesting and fascinating conversations and guests. And if you appreciate that, let me remind you, this is a value for value show. If you get any value out of the discussions and guests I bring to you, please consider getting some value back. It doesn't have to be financial. As always, I'll remind you, you can rate the show, review the show on whatever platform you're watching or listening to the Ripple Effect podcast. Please just write a review, thumbs up, share it. All that stuff helps, and it goes a long way to fight against the algorithms that suppress discussions and shows like these. And I'm laughing a little bit because this is a episode about suppression, and what better podcast to be on to talk about that than a podcast that has been kicked off YouTube and been suppressed on many platforms. But if you're in the holiday spirit and you're in a good financial situation, please consider getting some value back financially if you can. We have a Patreon page if you want to support us monthly, and that's one of the best ways of supporting us, because if a small percentage of people who listen and watch the Ripple Effect podcast donated as little as $1 a month, I could easily do the show full time. So no donation is too little. But if you don't want to support us on Patreon, there's other ways you can support us. You can send a one-time donation via Venmo or PayPal. You can also check out our merch store, and you can go directly to the merch store by going to the Ripple Effect Podcast merch.com, but all these links and more will be in the show description or on my website, therippleeffectpodcast.com. But on the merch store, there is tons of new designs and more to come. I can't thank Ryan Graham from Big Frog Merch and also the host of the Independent Review podcast for setting up an amazing merch store, for helping me out with all the amazing designs and giving me amazing quality and print for my listeners. So please check out the Ripple Effect Podcast merch.com. Support a podcast that you love and enjoy. And I believe that's it. Let's get right into this amazing conversation with Jeffrey Masson, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.
I believe in the ripple effect. Well, I definitely had a very unusual life, let's put it that way. I was born in the United States. I was born in Chicago in 1941, so that's 83 and a half years ago. And my parents moved around a lot. My father was from France. My mother had come from Israel, but had been born in Vienna. And they were both, at the time when I was born in 1941, they were very involved with Indian philosophy. So my father had found himself a guru, somebody who was living in Mysore, India, but was actually an English journalist by the name of Paul Brunton. He's not very well known anymore today, but at the time in the 40s, he was a best-selling author, Search and Secret India, Discover Yourself, um, The Hidden Teaching Beyond Yoga, and so on. And he introduced the Indian seer Ramana Maharshi to the West. And in fact, Somerset Maugham wrote a novel about him, After Many a Summer Dies the Swan, based on his life. So I grew up in a family that was very involved with Hinduism. So I was raised as a vegetarian, and I was to become the successor to Paul Brunton, which is kind of strange. I've just said it now. The successor was to happen many, many years later, where I was to become the successor to Kurt Eisler, the analyst who was the head of the Freud archive. So it seems to be my destiny to start something like that and say, whoa, whoa, this is not for me. In any event, by the time I was an adult, I have two boys now, my wife and I, who are 23 and 28, and they're so mature. And I was not at 23. I have to say, I was a student at Harvard, and I was studying Sanskrit because my parents wanted me to take over this guru's life. And I didn't think to object at that time. So it took me a long time to develop. And by the time I got my degree from Harvard in 1964 in Sanskrit, I was beginning to think, wait a minute, is this really for me? But I couldn't just walk away from it, because in those days, if you did Sanskrit, there wasn't a lot you could do with it. So I decided to pursue a graduate degree, PhD, in Sanskrit, which I did at Harvard. I spent time in India, 3 years actually, studying Sanskrit in various places, and then got my first position at the University of Toronto when I had what I sometimes think of as a negative epiphany. Whoop, what am I doing here? This is not me. And literally, from one day to the next, I said, this is not what I want to do with the rest of my life. By then, I was already an assistant professor of Sanskrit, and became the next year an associate professor. So I had tenure, and I saw my life stretching out in front of me teaching Sanskrit. I said, no, 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 this has got to stop. But I didn't really know what else to do. I was intrigued by human nature. So I thought, well, maybe I could become a psychoanalyst. I didn't know anything about it, really. I'd read one book, The Life of Freud by Ernest Jones. I thought, yeah, that's for me. In any event, I did apply for to become a psychoanalyst. And for reasons that remain a bit mysterious, they accepted me. They shouldn't have, because in those days, you either had to be a doctor with a degree in psychiatry, or you had to have a PhD in psychology. I had neither. I don't think they knew what Sanskrit was. I did have a PhD in Sanskrit, so they admitted me. And here's the strange thing. Immediately from day one, I realized that I had made another major error, because we were taught on day one, women are going to come into you as you're beginning your practice and tell you that they were abused as children. This is not so. They were not abused. They just think they were. They imagined. They fantasized it. They wished for it. It did not happen. And I remember very distinctly the first time we were told that, I was outraged. And I said, the equivalent, how on earth would you know that? How could you ever establish that if someone tells you, this is what happened to me, that you know more than they do about their life? And you tell them, no, it didn't. It went against everything I believed as a person. And I was told, look, you're the only non-medical person in this room. You know nothing about this. Just be quiet and listen and learn, which didn't sit well with me, but they did have a point. I didn't know much about it. Still, that lingered with me, and it stayed with me constantly. And by the time now, believe it or not, it's a 10-year program. So you have to be in analysis yourself for about 10 years. You start seeing patients halfway through, and then you are supervised with that. And eventually, after 10 years, you are made a psychoanalyst. Well, by the time that happened, I did finish. I did become a psychoanalyst. But by then I had pursued this, if you want to call it an obsession, you could say that, but I was convinced that Freud had made a mistake when he first said, and we're talking now 1896, so more than 100 years ago, he said, all the patients I've had have been abused as children. I thought, that's wonderful. That's exactly what I believe. But then he switched, or so we were told. He said, no, it's actually not true. And I wanted to know, why did he make that switch? I think he made a terrible mistake, but I wanted to know where it came from. So I met Anna Freud, who was Freud's daughter. And by then I had been active in giving papers about various aspects of this. And I was treated as a very junior but interesting kind of young psychoanalyst. And then I had the good fortune or misfortune to meet one of the leading analysts of the world, Kurt Eisler, Viennese, very close to Anna Freud. And he was taken with me for reasons that are still a bit mysterious. He liked me. And he said, you know what, Jeff, I don't think you should be a practicing analyst. That's not your strength. He was right. You're not a great listener. You're a better talker. You like doing research. Why don't you come with me and take over the Freud archives? Give up Sanskrit. You're not interested in it. By then, I was a full professor. So you don't need that. Take over the archives. I'm an old man. I'll be giving them up soon. I'll give them to you. I'll introduce you to Anna Freud, Freud's daughter. You'll live in her house. You'll turn it into a research center. And you'll do research on the kinds of things that fascinate you. I said, okay, sounds good. So I resigned my position. I visited Anna Freud, and we got on well because we both liked dogs. She loved dogs. I love dogs, still love dogs. And she asked me to improve my German. I knew a bit of German, but she wanted me to be fluent in German, or at least fluent enough to read it well. And then the big prize was in 1950, she had edited Freud's letters to his best friend, Wilhelm Fliess, an ear, nose, and throat specialist from Berlin. And these letters were called, they were published in 1950 by Anna Freud in German, 4 years later in English, The Origins of Psychoanalysis. And this is the Bible of psychoanalysis, the letters he wrote to his best friend, never thinking they would be published. Very revealing letters, very profound letters. And in those letters, he described how he first believed in sexual abuse and then gave it up. And it didn't quite make intellectual sense to me. And I always wondered, is there more to the story? Well, in the introduction, Anna Freud says, I have omitted 169 letters that I have from my father to Wilhelm Fliess because they are of no scientific interest. And who wants to just accept something like that? So I said, Miss Freud, with all due respect, I really would like to see those letters. And she said, well, many people have asked to see them. I have not given permission, but I'll tell you what, I'll give you 3 of those letters and let me see what you do with them. So she gave me 3 unpublished letters. And as luck would have it, those letters were extremely, and so remember now, these were unpublished. They had never seen the light of day, and they were extremely significant letters. And I was able to say to her, after working with them, studying with them, I had an elderly German woman who was able to read this old script of Freud's, and we transliterated it. And I was able to translate it, and I showed it to Anna Freud. I said, Miss Freud, with all due respect, this is one of the most beautiful letters your father ever wrote. And what it was a long case history. So the longest case history that Freud had ever written at that time, but unpublished. And it was about abuse. And at the end of it, he had this magnificent line. He quoted a line from the poem Goethe, poor child, what have they done to you? And I showed that to Anna Freud. I said, Miss Freud, this is the most beautiful thing your father ever wrote. Why would you omit that? It had a big red pencil through both sides saying, not for publication. And she said, because he was wrong. I said, well, you may believe that. I don't believe that. Why don't you let the public decide whether he was right or wrong? This is part of history. It's not for you or me to say this is the truth. This is what Freud wrote. Give him his voice. And she pondered and she said, okay, if you really want to publish these letters, I will let you do it. And I was very surprised. Now, we'll come back to this, Ricky, because I think only in the last few months have I thought about this in a new way, because a new book was just recently published about my assault on truth, where 14 psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, and psychologists wrestle with my book and say what influence it had on them. So this made me think about it after 40 years. And I'm now puzzled by why Anna Freud was willing to allow me, at the time, a very insignificant member of the tribe of psychoanalysts, young for a psychoanalyst at the time, was 40, not even. And I had no standing, really. I mean, Eisler liked me and a few analysts knew me, but I was hardly a power in the field. And it was a very traditional field with a heavy hierarchy. In your 60s, you became somebody to reckon with. So it puzzled people that Anna Freud would hand over this treasure, this family heirloom, to me. So we'll come back to that because I now have a hypothesis. But in any event, she did do it. And I did get Harvard University Press to agree to publish these letters. And I began doing elaborate research. I went to Paris, I went to Vienna, I went all over Europe, searching for how this story evolved and what was important about it and why it was significant to us today. So remember, this is 1984. It still wasn't really. There were some feminists like Judith Herman at Harvard, Florence Rush was the first woman, I believe, to write about sexual abuse of children against Freud, to say, yes, it's true, it's real, it's important. She was wonderful. We became good friends. But within the field, it just didn't exist. Nobody talked about this. So I started to give a few lectures about this, and it caused outrage in the field, literally outrage. I remember giving a talk in New Haven to a group of psychiatrists, mostly from Yale, and they were furious. They said, how dare you come to us with this information? You're a nobody. You have no right to these opinions. I was startled because for me, this was at the time, I mean, I believed it, of course, that it was real, that children were abused. I always believed that. I believed in trauma. I was fascinated by the Second World War. I was Jewish myself. I knew a lot about the Holocaust. Of course, I believed in the reality of trauma, but I couldn't quite believe that analysts of all people would be so reluctant to agree that trauma plays an important role in everyone's life, or at least everyone who's been, alas, hurt by some trauma. And there's almost nobody who hasn't had some trauma in their life. So it startled me that they were so angry at me. And it took on a personal level. They would say, how dare you come to a meeting of analysts wearing jeans? That kind of thing. Instead of saying, gee, these letters are interesting. Are you sure you understood them correctly? How good is your German? Maybe you didn't. Please read the German to us. A lot of us are German speakers. We'll see if we agree with you. No, it wasn't that. It was, who are you to bring this information up to us? And basically, I was very shortly, I mean, I was the director of the Freud Archives for less than a year. The New York Times ran a two-part series of articles about what I was finding, and I was kicked out. From one day to the next, they took away, Eisler said, you're no longer my successor. You're no longer one of the directors of the Freud copyright. You will not live in Anna Freud's house. The Toronto Psychoanalytic Society, where I trained, said, you're no longer a member of our society. The internationalists are the same. You're no longer an analyst. You are finished. So it was very strange times and very, very upsetting for me. I tried to fight it. Eisler did say, well, I'm holding a meeting of the 9 directors of the Freud archives, and if you insist on being present, you may. It's your right to do so, and we'll tell you why you're an awful person and why you cannot be the director of the archives. And I did go, and it was a very, I mean, I haven't talked about this for a long time because I've kind of pushed it out of my mind, but there I was with 9 senior psychoanalysts, all male. One woman, Eisler's wife, who was a psychoanalyst, was practically in tears and left the room. Clearly felt some sympathy for me, but the others were all outraged. And I said, well, tell me what I did. All I've done is engage in research. None of you know about this. I went to Paris. I read all these letters. I put it all together. Anna Freud gave me access to other letters about Sandor Ferencz. He's a fascinating story. Yes, you and I may disagree about the reality of child abuse, but I haven't done anything dishonest. Why are you kicking me out? And Freud, there's a nice slip for you. Eisler's comment to me was, you have betrayed the family. It's almost like an Italian La Cosa Nostra, omertà. You are a member of the mafia. You cannot talk to outsiders. You have betrayed the family. I said, but I just have a different opinion about the reality of abuse. And I found documents that support what I have to say. If I'm wrong, tell me where I'm wrong. And he was apoplectic, Eisler, just trembling. He said, I loved you. I treated you like a son, which was true. And I never quite got why for him or any of them this was so important. I suppose that many of these analysts, and this is just something of a hypothesis, many of these analysts had told patients who came to them, you think you were abused, but you were not. And I know for a fact that when the New York Times wrote about what I was finding, that many of these patients came to their analyst and said, wait a minute, here's this guy Masson, and he's uncovering documents that showed that maybe it's not such a simple story. What do you make of that? So I was seen as having betrayed the field. Now, for many people today, that seems perplexing. I mean, I'm sure that very few psychologists in the broader sense are taught that women make up or lie about child abuse. But then they did. Then they absolutely believed it was rare. The American Handbook of Psychiatry said that incest takes place 1 in a million cases. And today we know, no comparison. I mean, I don't know, 10% at least. So it's huge, the difference.
Well, a couple of really interesting points. One, I find it fascinating when you research history, a lot of the people who uncover things or come up with these brilliant ideas are usually not the experts, the people that are part of the group, because what ends up happening is you end up living in an echo chamber, right? You end up being
Exactly.
living around just, like before we started the show talking about pub culture and how it's important for people to gather and debate and all these things. Like if you're around everybody who's kind of just accepted something to be true and nobody pushes back against it, how do you, you just end up, everybody just will accept something and nobody will ever go back and say, you know what, maybe there's something wrong with this type of thinking or this philosophy or this ideology or whatnot. I love having people on that push against stuff, and I've uncovered stuff myself. Like I remember the first time I had Gerard Williams on, who's a British journalist. He wrote the book Escape of Adolf Hitler, a Grey Wolf, Escape of Adolf Hitler. He wrote the book, and there's a film about it. And I remember the first time I had him on, I had all these like World War II buffs who would hit me up and be, oh no, he's wrong. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And I would research and you're like, you guys have been just regurgitating a lie. There's very little to no evidence that he actually died in Germany. And there's a lot more evidence that he made it to Argentina. And and it was just one of those things where I'm like, we just keep saying he died in Germany, he died in Germany, he died in Germany, and nobody's actually researched it. And then when you get somebody like Gerard Williams who actually looks into it, he was a part of, I don't know if it was Nat Geo or Discovery Channel, History Channel, one of the big networks that actually went to Germany, did DNA tests on the bones. It wasn't even a male; it's a female. Like there's no evidence that he died, but people just regurgitated it. Same thing with I had this author Manuel Rosa, who's a Portuguese author, writes about the history of Christopher Columbus and his his possible identity and who he really was, and it's same thing. Like he was just one of those guys that are like, hey, everybody's accepting this narrative, this story, but I think there might be more to this. And then he ends up researching and finding out that the story that everybody's accepting and regurgitating, like there's not a whole lot there. There's not there's not really a lot of evidence to back the theories. And trauma is important. Like you were talking about before. Like I've always been intrigued with like epigenetics and like there's a article, I believe it's called Inheriting Father's Fears, which talk about the experiment where they had a completely synthetic scent that they would spray near mice, and every time they would smell it and they would spray it, they would shock them, and then for 2 generations later, without ever being shocked, every time they'd smell that scent, their children and then children would have the same panic reaction, and it was a synthetic scent. It could have never been exposed to it in a natural world. So it's which sparks the conversation of like trauma. Like, can it be inherited? Do you necessarily have to go through something to cause trauma? You could be dealing with some type of trauma that wasn't even from your personal physical experience, but maybe from past experiences. So it's fascinating, and the importance of that can't be understated. Like, and to just kind of poo-poo everything away, like, oh, it's just this, or this didn't happen or that didn't happen, or not believing somebody's explanation of their trauma is fascinating. Why do you think, and I believe they called it the seduction theory, right? Like, why do they, why do you think they wanted to suppress this information so much? Why would something like, that seems pretty innocent, like, Jeffrey just had this different interpretation and uncovered some information that maybe went against the consensus of this this work. Why do you think there is so much pushback?
Well, that is the interesting question. Why did they invest so heavily in the seduction theory being nothing but a theory and a fantasy and wrong? Why did they do that? I think you're right. I think it is a kind of guild, instead of being the pub where everybody's discussing, you have so-called experts, and they say, look, we know this, you don't. You haven't had the experience for understanding this. And the truth is that psychoanalysis is not really a science, even at its best. It's a theory of how the mind works. And almost everybody who has a mind has a different idea of how the mind works. There are no experts when it comes to love and feelings and even trauma. Trauma is not something that you can be an expert in. Yes, there are probably some people who know more about it than others, but everybody has their own interpretation of the things that happen to them. And they don't always need an expert to come along and say, here's what happened and here's what didn't happen, especially what didn't. It's one thing to listen to somebody and another thing to try and interpret their truth for them. I think that's a very dangerous thing to do. So once they had done that, once psychoanalysis decided that events like that were extremely uncommon, and people would come in and say, but it happened to me. And they'd say, well, I don't think so. I think you're engaging in a fantasy. And they convince them of them, that's a terrible thing to have done to someone. So I think someone challenging that was considered a dangerous outsider, really a counter theory. And I was not trying to propose my own theory of how the mind works. God forbid. I mean, we don't know. But I was saying, let's be a bit humble about this. And they didn't want to do that. So they regarded it as a challenge. Now, here's the interesting thing that you might think about why then would Anna Freud, who was the epitome, she was at the very top of this hierarchy. I mean, she was the queen of psychoanalysis. Everybody wanted to meet Anna Freud, Freud's daughter, after all, and engage with her. She was not an easy person to engage with. She was very cool, um, was not chatty. So the question is, why would she allow this young outsider, barely an analyst himself, to come in and be given this treasure trove of letters? Now, part of the explanation is that Eisler vouched for me, and Eisler was her age, elderly, very powerful within the analytic community, a great scholar, published many, many books, and a formidable man. But it wasn't enough. I believe now, Rick, that she herself had doubts about this, that she herself wondered whether her father had not made a terrible error. And who was she going to find to whom she could give these letters and be certain that they would be published as they were, that they would not omit anything? Because it's not as if, if you look at the letters that I published with Harvard, the complete letters of Freud to Fliess, I don't give my own interpretation. I just give the letters. Here they are. I've edited them. I've translated them. I annotate them, but I don't intrude. And I think she wanted someone who would do that, a scholarly edition, and let people see for themselves. And the truth is that the general public saw it, but analysts did not. So there were analysts, when this complete edition came out, said, I don't like it. I prefer my earlier edition, the one from 1950 that omitted 159 letters. I don't need these intrusive letters about the reality of abuse. I don't need that. In other words, they blinded themselves to what Freud himself had said. It was hard for them, including Eisler, to accept a new paradigm, to accept the fact that their master had made a mistake, and a serious one, and that they had to shift their position. They didn't want to do that. They may have done it now, but that's 40 years later. But in the beginning, they did not. It was much easier to attack me than to think about what were the repercussions from this new material.
I've heard people give their opinions on why they think this information was suppressed, and some people tend to believe, and it is interesting because when you think about it, some of the people I've heard discuss this, they talk about how sexual abuse in general, in the public's eye, a lot of times they try to paint it as a lower class issue, right? So it's stuff that you see in trailer parks with like stepdads who are drinking too much and abusing kids or whatever it may be. But the upper class, that's not where it happens. It's not an upper class issue. And do you think there's anything to the fact that maybe they were trying to suppress or disguise the fact that in the upper classes, this is a much bigger issue than people think? I know you've talked to, you've been on somebody who's been on my podcast a few times and has done amazing work on this topic. Nick Bryan and the Nick Bryan podcast, wrote this Franklin scandal, which, he was one of the first people to really highlight these issues, how it's not political, it's not this, it's not, it's like, it's just, it seems to be everywhere. But it does seem to be, if you were looking for some common thread, it does seem like it's a upper class issue in regards to, like, you see it in Hollywood, you see it, with Weinstein, you see it in politics, you see it in science, you see it in, everywhere. And it just seems like is it possible that they had these issues then and it was a spreading issue in the upper classes, and they were concerned about possibly this sparking some insight into how common this issue is in the upper classes?
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned Rick Bryan. It's a brilliant book he wrote, and he got a lot of pushback for that too at the time. And he was the first one to see the Jeffrey Epstein notebooks, the flight records, and got pushback for that too. because of the number. I mean, we still don't know the full story of the Jeffrey Epstein and what was Bill Clinton doing there, what was Trump doing there. All these things are still. And I think in Freud's time, when he gave his famous 1896 paper to a group of, let's say, there were 50 psychiatrists, all male, and he said, my 18 patients have been abused. He was accusing some of them because a lot of the patients that came to Freud were the children of his colleagues. And they did not want to think of themselves or their colleagues as capable of this. As you say, yes, the lower class, yes, servants, yes, trailer parks, but not professors, not judges, not lawyers, not doctors. And of course, that's not true. It goes across. Abuse happens everywhere. So they did not want that. Now, one of the interesting issues is that he gave his paper. They made fun of him in 1896, and he wrote a letter to his best friend saying, I gave my paper. A void is forming around me. They are avoiding me. I'm not getting patients. They're treating me like a non-entity. And Anna Freud took that out. She did not want that published. And again, one of the things I went to her and said, Miss Freud, now that I have them, your father was deeply upset at the way his colleagues responded. Why would you take that out? She said, well, it makes him sound paranoid. I said, but he wasn't paranoid. He was there. He saw. He gave them a truth, and they turned their back on him and mocked him. Don't you want him to have his voice in this? So I think, Anna Freud was put in a very, very difficult situation because for 100 years, we had been reading Freud wrong. We didn't know that he had said, I told them the truth and they mocked me. Because he then changed his mind, said they were right, but they weren't right. He was right the first time. And we know that he pushed back. So it's amazing that she had the courage to allow me to put that in the public sphere, because it was not an easy thing for her to do. And when all hell broke out, when I was fired and all of this happened, I never spoke to her again. She died in 1982, so a year later. But I suspect that it was very hard on her. My own feeling, I wish I could have gone back and called her. I think that she did not like the fact that they piled on me. I think, because remember, she could at that point have withdrawn permission for me to publish those letters. It was still her decision. And I'm sure they must have said to her, including Eisler, tell him he can't publish them. Tell Harvard they cannot publish those letters. They're your letters. You are withdrawing permission. But she didn't do that. She allowed them to be published with Harvard University Press. And they came out in 1984. So what are we to make of that? She could have stopped it, and she didn't. So I believe that she knew that I was onto something important.
And do you think, not to psychoanalyze Freud, but do you think that maybe initially he did want to put, he didn't want to accept what ended up being the accepted, perspective of his theory, but he did initially want to, I guess, tell the truth about what he really thought, but and then because of the pushback, and like you said, one thing people don't think about is that his clients were of very wealthy upper class people. So if he was honest with what he thought was going on, I mean, he would demonize all his clients and people around him, and maybe his friend circle and whatnot. So do you think maybe his heart was in the right place, and it was due to public pressure that he ended up
Absolutely, Rick. Absolutely. That is my belief. And that I wrote in my book in 1984. I said I felt that he had a loss of moral courage. And as you say, understandably, because had he persisted in this, he would have been, as he said, totally isolated. He would have been the only male in history who said this, that there was a consequence, that the consequences of abuse would follow someone for the rest of their life. He would have been the first, he was the first male to say that. Had he stood by that, he would have been alone. And she, Anna Freud, said, but if my father said that and believed it, there would have been no psychoanalysis. And I sort of shrugged my shoulders. Well, what's more important, the truth or a profession?
Is it possible that the pressure came from like they were using Freud as a tool to hide sexual abuse in regards to almost like if you are the upper class and you are linked to this guy that can change public perception, public opinion on trauma and these sexual abuse, why not try to disguise it or hide it by saying, hey, if we get Freud to say this is all made up, this isn't real, then maybe we can continue doing what we're doing and none of us get in trouble because he's convinced you that your kid's crazy and that his experience.
Yeah, Rick, that's certainly what happened. That's exactly what happened. Freud became the champion. That's the mystery of this, the paradox, the tragedy, if you will, from having been the first person in history to say it's real and it's terrible and it's going to affect them for their whole life. And that's why they're unhappy. He became the person who said, there's no such thing. It happens so rarely, you don't need to think about it. So he really completely switched sides. And then that's one of the things I tried to bring out in my talks. Then he was accepted back into society. He became the first psychoanalyst and had a following, was the head of a major movement in the history of ideas. Had he stuck to his guns then, he would have been ignored and possibly never published anything after that one article. So it's interesting. Now, we'll jump forward for a minute. He did build a movement, and he was surrounded by a number of very brilliant psychiatrists, all of them then. One in particular that he loved more than anyone else was a Hungarian by the name of Sándor Ferenczi. And he was very, very close to Freud. And in 1932, so when Ferenczi was in his late 50s, he determined that child abuse was real. So he went back to Freud's initial insights, and he wrote a paper called The Confusion of Tongues Between Children and Adults. And it was about the reality, the common reality of sexual abuse. I consider it, even today, one of the great papers about child abuse ever written. And he wrote it, and word got out that he had written this. And Freud said, I want to hear the paper. And he said, okay, I will bring it to you, but only to you. I want you to listen to it with respect. I know it's not your views anymore, but I want you to think about it. And Freud, instead of saying yes, he said yes, but he had himself surrounded with his lieutenants. And Ferenczi came and read the paper to Freud, and Freud was horrified. And when Ferenczi realized that Freud would not accept this, and neither would his disciples, and Freud told them in secret, he must not be allowed to give this paper. So analysts, and one of the criticisms of me is that, oh, you, Mason, you said Freud never believed in child abuse. He did, he just didn't give it the same importance. He always believed that it was real and important, but just not as important as you say. That's not true. And that's the absolute proof. We have a letter that Anna Freud handed to me, which had been unpublished, which he wrote his disciples, do not allow Ferenczi to give this paper. And Ferenczi was brokenhearted. He did give the paper. They did not publish it in English for 14 years on the grounds that it was heresy. But he was so hurt by Freud's response that he died shortly thereafter, I believe, of a broken heart. He was only, I think he was 59, much too young to have died. And today there's a movement around the world to bring back Ferenczi. There are societies, Ferenczi societies in Hungary, in England, in Brazil, in Argentina, around the world, in New York, recognizing the importance that Ferenczi had. So he was right. And Freud could not accept that. And neither could the people at the time. So in 1932, it's not as if he analyzed a number of very, very prominent analysts at the time, but they all abandoned him once Freud said no. So he was alone. So exactly what happened to Freud in 1896 happened to Ferenczi in 1932. Then, fast forward to 1975, Wilhelm Fliess had a son by the name of Robert Fliess, who rose to great prominence in New York as a psychoanalyst. So he analyzed Leonard Schengold, who analyzed Oliver Sacks, so there's a major genealogy there. And he announced in 1975 that his father, Wilhelm Fliess, nobody less than Freud's closest friends, had abused him as a child. And the analysts were appalled. And he had to leave New York City. He moved to upstate New York, where he died in obscurity. His widow found out what I was doing, got in touch with me. I went to visit her, and she said it was a terrible tragedy. The minute he told the truth, he was rejected, exactly as Freud and exactly as Ferenczi. And of course, fast forward to 1984, when I published The Assault on Truth, same thing happened to me. You are crazy. You're a nutcase. I even had in Munich, they suggested that I be sectioned and put into a psychiatric asylum for being paranoid and believing women. So up until then, you could not say these things. And that changed fairly rapidly. Feminism became more and more important. By the late 80s and early 90s, the whole thing had changed. Mind you, I was not part of that at the time. I mean, I'm sure my book had something to do with it, but I was never invited a single time to a psychoanalytic institute to talk about the history of this, not once. So analysts did not, they went kicking and screaming into the future. They did not want to admit they were wrong.
And this is an important story because in so many of these stories about researchers and research and people that become historic figures, like you realize there's a lot of politics involved. There's a lot of people wanting their name to be a part of a legacy. They want their name to be famous. They want these things. I remember when I had Dr. Robert Malone on the show. He's one of the inventors of the mRNA technology. And he talked about just like all the back and forth pulling and fighting about like they almost didn't care as much about doing the research and doing the what he thought was the fun part, and they cared more about like who's going to get the credit for it, and there's all this fighting and like, oh, we want our institute to get the credit for this patent or that or this or that, so there is a lot of politics behind the scenes with a lot of this stuff, and why one person becomes a household name and maybe why another great thinker becomes suppressed.
Absolutely, absolutely. The politics of knowledge is a very interesting thing. And of course, for years and years, women, by and large, were pushed to the side. So even when, James Watson, in discovering DNA, Rosalind Franklin, her name didn't come up once, but in fact, he had stolen a photograph from her, which was the basis of this. Now we know it. But at the time, I think she died in obscurity. So that happens quite a bit, even within science,
Yeah, I'm
even within hard science, let alone the science of the mind, which is not a hard science.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. You talked to. I've always had an issue with psychology and psychiatrists because they do call it science. They call it DSM. They use the word science, and the thing is, I know plenty of people who have dealt with depression and mental illnesses and issues, and I mean, there's not a whole lot of science between in regards to how they treat these people. You know, I have family members, friends, and it's like they call the chemical imbalance. There is no test to check which chemical is imbalanced
No.
or how imbalanced it is. They literally just say, "You are now my guinea pig. Try this pill, up the dosage. If that doesn't work, try this one." And yet nobody tells you that exercise, sun, all these things, social, just having a social circle, having friends, family, feeling fulfilled in other ways, having a purpose, like all these things will get you to a happy place much better than and coming from somebody who probably has a spiritual background and been around gurus, like there is, even though there is a lot of probably nonsense and people who just try to sell nonsense in that world, there's also a lot of good too. You can learn a lot of things and you can also realize that like happiness does start inside. It doesn't,
Of course. Yeah. I mean, I totally believe with you. I mean, I think vitamin D, sunshine, these are proven things. Psychiatric drugs, I have never been a fan of psychiatric drugs. They're powerful, they have terrible side effects. There's no real science behind it. And in any event, the human mind is not an object that you can take out and look at, you know. And even the brain, we understand 1 millionth of what the brain is capable of. So when people become arrogant about the science of the mind, I'm very skeptical.
no.
And certainly when it comes to the emotions, nobody knows more about love or any of these feelings. We have disappointment, depression than anyone else. And certainly no one's an expert on your feelings.
Yeah, and I think
But we live, yeah,
oh, I was just gonna say and that's the thing that we have to realize that all these things are theories, and theories means that it can change and it can evolve, and it's just somebody's opinion or perspective based on maybe some research and gathering information. But a theory doesn't mean it's fact, doesn't mean it's undeniable. And science, that's what science should be. Science should always rediscover new things and question old things, and that's kind of what it was.
absolutely. I totally agree. We can say we now know that these kinds of things happen much more frequently than we suppose. And then you could say, okay, so what are the results of that? If you were hit as a child, if you were sexually abused, if you were starved, if you were humiliated, if you were treated as a non-entity, if you were abandoned, if your father didn't care about you, or was jealous of you, or all kinds of things, we can think, well, those are real things and they will have effects, but nobody can say, here's exactly what that will lead to. So I mean, we shouldn't be arrogant about that. And I think eventually we'll have much more information. I mean, I think it's a wonderful thing that people now write their autobiographies. So you get far more information than we ever had. In Freud's day, think about this. When he gave his paper in 1896, there was not a single paper or book about having suffered as a child. Nobody had written an autobiography and said, this is what happened to me. And if they had, they wouldn't have gotten it published. If a woman had said, my father, Judge so and so, professor of medicine, did this to me, nobody would have published it. That was not known. And today, that's very different. There are literally thousands of autobiographies of women who have, especially women, but men too, but women in particular, who've suffered. We know that today. You cannot deny it any longer. What the consequences are, That's up for reflection. But nobody should be arrogant and say, I can tell you exactly what the consequences are. And certainly not, there are no consequences.
Yeah,
Hey, suck it up. That's not psychology.
you're right. I'm still a little torn if I feel like the reason why this theory and this information was suppressed due to maybe they had this historic figure that they don't want to paint the brush that he could be possibly wrong, and maybe that would open the door, the Pandora box, to like now everybody's questioning his work. Or do you think it was maybe darker than that, that it was a hierarchy trying to hide sexual abuse? I mean, which one?
I think it was. I think it was the latter because he was not somebody to be reckoned with in 1896. Oh, he was just a young researcher. And he gave, it's a beautiful paper. It's called The Etiology of Hysteria. In other words, the source of hysteria. By hysteria, he just meant neurosis, unhappiness. And he began the paper by saying, gentlemen, I have discovered the caput nili, the source of the Nile of psychopathology. I know why people become unhappy. So there was a huge challenge for him to make. And they began to laugh immediately. How dare you suggest that you know something we don't know? But I agree with you. We go behind that. It wasn't just that they thought he was wrong, they were worried. Some of those men, I mean, let's say there were 50 people present. I would say maybe 20 of them had done some form of abuse to some child. And they did not want a detective on their trail. So, what better way to make sure that didn't happen than to mock it, make fun of it, and say, ah, what do you know? And they succeeded because he began to question himself. Now, the question we can ask is, was he being honest with himself? Did he think, well, maybe they're right? Or was he just ambitious and didn't want to give up his position as a junior member of this fraternity? You know, it's almost, I mean, think of what happens in a fraternity today in college. They do terrible things. And some of those young boys, 19, 18, 19, they don't want to go along with that. But they make fun of them and say, what's the matter? You're not a man? Huh? And they mock them and then they go along with something they don't believe in.
Yeah,
Those ceremonies where they torture young, what do they call them? The freshmen that are coming in. And they have these nasty ceremonies. It's that kind, and it is a male thing. Remember, no, we're not a single woman in that room where Freud gave this paper. No woman was there. Suppose there were, instead of 50 men, there were 25 women, and 5 of them raise their hand and say, yeah, you're right. It happened to me, or it happened to my sister. It happened to my aunt. I know it. That would have caused a scandal, but it might have made an impression. But there wasn't a single woman in that room.
and culturally, the thing is, even just logically, the idea that it couldn't be sexual abuse seems absolutely crazy to me because culturally, historically, there's always been a history, and you can find evidence of it in all different parts of the world, all different cultures, religions, of sexual abuse.
Of
And
course.
so why couldn't it be a possibility? It seems absurd.
But you go back to your point of earlier that it's a class issue. Yes, Freud would be willing, and so would everyone else there, to say a servant did that. Yes, that can happen. But to say her father did that, a judge did that, a professor, a medical person, a prominent businessman, that nobody would say. They couldn't. They wouldn't get away with it. And even today, it's hard. I mean, look how long it took to get Weinstein. Look how long it took to get Jeffrey Epstein. These were powerful figures in society.
Now, coming from somebody who's done a lot of thinking and research and writing about these topics, it's I've had people like Whitney Webb on the show who've talked about Jeffrey Epstein before. Kind of, he was a household name. People like Nick Bryan, other people who've been who've written about child abuse and child trafficking and all these things. And you do see these reoccurring theme of hurt people, right? Some of them are people who are dealing with their own trauma, and it is and it's wild because I'll have this conversation with people, and some people they don't there's no empathy towards them. They're animals. They're the worst people in the world. You always hear people talk about pedophiles and whatnot, and it's always like kill them all, lock them all up, shoot them in and it's like. And I'm always one of those people that I like to try to, and this is probably why I find your work intriguing. I always like to find the why, and I like to go deeper. And to me, it's like, okay, maybe they are evil people. Maybe they did do something that there is no forgiving. But why and how? And were they harmed? Were they I remember there.
Almost certainly. Yeah. You
Yeah.
remember what? Sorry, I interrupted.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I need interrupting sometimes. I also like to talk. But no, just this story about there was this murder in Connecticut. So I live in Massachusetts, and I remember I think it made national news. There was this murder in Connecticut where these people went into this house and like burned the house and killed the family or whatever. And then it was like this crazy story that everybody was like intrigued with. And then there was like a film about it, and I don't know if it was a documentary or a film, but they went into the history of the guy who killed the family. And he was like very religious family. I can't remember if he was Christian or Catholic, but his parents were just very religious, and they talked about that sex was evil and it was a devil's doing, and desire was evil, and it was the devil trying to get you to do awful things. And then he was molested. This child, as a child, this murderer was molested as a child, and his mother walks into the bathroom because she didn't know that he was molested, and he was trying to cut off his what because
Wow.
felt like something bad happened to him, and he felt so guilty because of what happened. So it's one of
Wow.
these things where like you hear these stories and you're like, okay,
Yeah.
how do I not feel bad for the person who did this horrendous thing? And then you almost feel guilt, as an individual. I'm like, well, should I really feel bad for this guy? He created victims, but it's this vicious cycle of like victims creating more victims. And then you have to ask the question of like, okay, when do I stop feeling bad for them, and when are they responsible for their own actions, and that
Mm.
type of thing. But somebody who's I'm sure has thought about this. Are the majority of cases this? But everything needs a starting point, right? So it's like, who?
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't believe, I mean, I go further than that. I would say that there's no case that I have ever looked into of a serial killer where there wasn't some form of abuse in their own past. And I mean, you just look at politicians today. Uh, Putin had a horrible childhood. Trump had a horrible childhood. All of these people who are vicious and hurt other people have been hurt themselves. The difference is they can't admit it. Trump, if you said, I mean, if you sat him down and say, look, your father was awful, he would never admit to that. My father was wonderful. He taught me to be a selfish, egotistical human being. He can't. I mean, it's very hard. And it's kind of a mystery. Why is it so hard for people to admit what happened to them? It is, I suppose. Well, for one thing, of course, it was very hard for women because they were not believed. So, what would a woman do in Freud's day? He was the only person for a short time who would listen to them. Everybody else say, "Oh no, that never happened." And when you know that something happened to you, but nobody believes you, that's a terrible thing. I
Yeah,
think your I think your bell is saying enough of you, Mason.
no. Was that my bell or your bell? I'm not.
I think it was your bell,
It,
but maybe not.
it is a fascinating topic because it's
It
like
is.
is it just this vicious cycle that is been inherited into our culture. And I wonder how many, like you said, how many examples are there of like being able to trace back to the first person who had no trauma, who, did something evil or and caused.
I've never met anyone so far that I know well who hasn't had some form of trauma in their life, depending on how broadly you are willing to define that.
Yeah. And like
I think we want to define it very broadly,
and
very
like
important.
discussed before, I'm curious, even if there wasn't any trauma from their actual physical life, like we talked about with some of the studies showing that you can inherit trauma. I wonder if some people who don't seem to have any lived trauma is dealing with some inherent trauma from
Of course, yeah. Yeah, no, no, definitely. I mean, the very fact that you grow up with somebody who was traumatized, even if you weren't, that is going to affect you, whether it's at an epigenetic level or just psychological level. The fact that you live with a depressed mother who was depressed for good reasons, is that going to affect you? Of course, it will affect you. Of course, it will. And it's always a mystery to me that there's some people who seem to survive terrible childhood incidents without it turning them into a bitter person. I know a few people like that, but very few. Most people suffer the consequences. And it can be subtle. My father didn't like me. I definitely had that feeling growing up. He was jealous for all kinds of reasons. My mother loved me, and he never got that love from his mother. So he resented it. And did that affect me? Of course it did. But it's not something I thought about every day. I just noted that, we clashed a lot. Whereas I love it when my children, my two boys, they're 28 and 23. I love it when they're successful. They buy new clothes. They get I don't like it when my son comes home with a very fast motorcycle, but it's only briefly. But, I take pleasure um, in their fruition and their flourishing. My father did not. So did that affect me? Sure, it affects you. And I mean, I guess that's how therapy works. I'm not a great fan of therapy. I wrote a book called Against Therapy. So, but I can see that people who've been hurt want to discuss it with someone. They want somebody to be sympathetic. They want someone to listen to them and to take it in. But of course, it's a little bit of a challenge because you don't know how they're taking this. You never know how the person in front of you is listening. What are they hearing? Ah, he's foolish. Oh, he's lying. Ah, it's not so bad. You know what I mean? You can't. We all fantasize having this all knowing, all loving, all compassionate person who listens to us and feels it. But you don't know that you're going to get that. So I'm a skeptic of therapy in general.
And I actually like that theory. I've talked about it quite a bit. I grew up a musician, and I felt like, hey, writing these songs was kind of like my therapy. I would talk about it. I would get it out in the open. And then, I started, I forget who it was that was questioning therapy, much like yourself, and talking about how every time you talk about it, you're reliving it. And if you constantly do that, it gets to a point where it's not actually helping, it's actually hurting. And it kind of makes sense because I'm one of those people that, like, in my 9 to 5, my full-time job, I don't ever talk about it at home because when I'm with my kids, when I'm with my wife, like, I want to be the best version of me. And I find myself reliving a stressful situation and those emotions coming to the surface if I'm just telling the story. So it's like, oh, I had this bad day at work. I got, this guy gave me crap for this and whatnot. And he was such a jerk and he's always giving me crap. And then, like, next thing you know, I'm like, I'm getting worked up, even though I'm around calm and collected people who have nothing to do with this, and I'm just sharing the story. But in the process of sharing the story, I am now kind of retrieving those emotions that I had during that stressful situation. And I'm just like, okay, if I was doing this in therapy, if I'm constantly telling this story and uh, just grabbing deep into my psyche and my subconscious, these maybe emotions that maybe it's okay to kind of just leave them back there, and but I'm grabbing them and I'm bringing them back and I'm reliving them and I'm refeeling them, I'm re-experiencing them. Like, when does it get to a point where now I'm just all I'm doing is giving myself trauma over and over again because I'm
Yeah,
talking.
good point. I mean, yeah, my kids say, enough, Dad. We've heard all your stories 1,000 times. Thank you very much. I mean, when you become a dad, or when you're a husband, and when you live with someone in intimacy, you learn you can't just share everything over and over. You got to know when to just live your life.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that talking about and reliving trauma over and over again, it does get to a point where it becomes counterproductive. I think that, you
I
know,
agree.
there's we have this theory and this perspective that, like, oh, you shouldn't just keep things deep locked inside somewhere in your subconscious and whatnot, because even if you don't know it, it's bothering you, and so I do believe that there probably is. And again, like you said, not everything is black and white. Like, one thing that works for another person or is beneficial for one person, maybe for one person it is beneficial to talk about it over and over again, but maybe somebody else is coping with trauma by putting it in back, in the back of their brain, not reliving it, not what. I remember once on a podcast, I was sharing a story, and it just came up because it was an organic conversation, and it just sparked this memory that I've been kind of maybe unknowingly suppressing for a long time. And I'm like, wow, I have not thought about that in forever. And I'm like, I wonder if I purposely not thought about that in forever. And if, if maybe that's a okay thing. Maybe it's okay that I put that aside and so and like you said, like, these things aren't scientific in regards to, like, there's a truth and untrue. Like, it's just everybody's slightly different. The way they perceive
Correct.
things is slightly different, and people are complex. And not everybody gets the same benefits out of the same things and work the same way or perceive things the same way. So it's funny because sometimes people will get so heated about, like, politics or whatever, and I'm just
Yeah,
like, they think they're just as right about their worldview as you are about yours. Like, but
that's right. Yeah, I have to tell myself that all the time. Well, Ricky, it's been really wonderful.
it has been
I've
wonderful. I
enjoyed it.
thank you so much
Yeah,
for being just honest and having the courage to be outspoken and doing something that wasn't very popular. I think the world needs more people like you, and I'm so glad that your book is starting to gather attention again.
thank you.
And I
I
think
appreciate how reflective you are, and how you are a good listener, better than me in any event.
I try to be, and but hey, we need good talkers, because then I would be talking to myself. So it's I'm glad to have people like yourself out there who take the time out of their.
Let me know what some of the responses will be. That'll be interesting.
Yeah, I'll share. I'll send you the links to the audio and video once it's out and live, and feel
Fantastic.
free to post it anywhere you want. All my work's open source. It's about getting the conversations out there. But enjoy
Fantastic.
the rest of your day. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
making this
You
happen,
too.
and we'll keep in touch. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Okay. Pleasure, Rick. Thanks so much. Bye now.